It's my pleasure to have Jen here with us today. Jennifer Cartwright's an ecologist and geographer with the Tennessee office of the Lower Miss Gulf Water Science Center. She's broadly interested in understanding the drivers of biodiversity across a range of ecosystems, and in particular ecohydrology, which is a study of how water interacts and affects natural communities. Her previous work has examined how water management practices affect fish communities and streams, and how climate change may affect island-like ecosystems in the southeastern U.S. And her current work focuses on drought and climate change in the Pacific Northwest. So Jen's here to talk about some of her work, and my pleasure to introduce her. Here she is.
All right. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good.
All right, good. So thank you for everyone for being in this webinar, and I want to thank the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center for inviting me to speak, and I want to thank the Northwest Climate Science Center for supporting this work. My email address is on the screen. We will have some time at the end for questions and discussion. But also, if you have any other ideas or suggestions or questions for me, please don't hesitate to contact me. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit, explaining what we mean by drought refugia or hydrologic refugia. And then I'll present some preliminary results from a couple studies in southern Oregon using remote sensing to look for refugia. And I'll briefly touch on some work to scale up some of this analysis to the regional level. And then finally, I'll talk about some ongoing collaborative work to really connect the science around refugia to the needs and priorities of natural resource managers. So to start, I want to highlight two recent papers that are really helpful for anyone that would like more background on these concepts. This first is by Morelli et al., came out last year in PLOS One, called Managing Climate Change Refugia for Climate Adaptation. And the second is by McLaughlin et al., came out earlier this year in Global Change Biology, called Hydrologic Refugia, Plants and Climate Change. So these are two excellent references if you'd like to get some more in-depth background from these two review papers on these concepts of refugia. So this figure is from Morelli et al., 2016, and it's just showing a variety of landscape features that might promote climate change refugia. So basically the idea is that as climate change is progressing, that could include warming. In some cases, in some locations, it might include climatic drying and drought intensification. Those effects are not going to be homogeneous across the landscape. There may be localized areas that are somewhat buffered where overall change is less or perhaps is changing less rapidly than the surrounding landscape. So there's been a fair amount of interest in climate change refugia over the past decade or so. And a lot of that work has focused on temperature buffering from warming and somewhat less emphasis on hydrology and soil moisture. But you know, in places where climate change is expected to alter the duration or the intensity or the frequency of droughts, we could imagine that drought refugia, areas of the landscape that retain biologically available water during droughts, could become increasingly important to wildlife and vegetation. So this figure is from McLaughlin et al., 2017. I find it really helpful to remember that refugia are not necessarily places where nothing is changing. So this figure conceptualizes three kinds of refugia. So, and this is in the context of climatic drying, possibly drought intensification. So to the left, you have a stable refugium. So this could be a place hydrologically where things are not changing through time with climate change, whereas to the right, you have a relative refugium. And so even within this refugium, hydrologic conditions could be changing, in this case getting drier. And the hydrologic requirements shift from species 1 to species 2. So you have ecological and hydrologic change happening even within the refugium, although it remains moister than much of the surrounding landscape. And then on the right, you have this idea of a transient refugium, which is where if there are certain climatic or climate change thresholds that get surpassed, then that landscape location just might not be able to fulfill that function at all anymore. Okay, so how would we go about finding these locations on the landscapes? For example, refugia during drought. There's no question that field observations and measurements on the ground during droughts are critically important because, for one thing, we need to understand species-specific responses, and we need to understand interspecies interactions that are helping to define refugia. But, you know, droughts can affect vast landscapes, and in the case of remote areas and rugged terrain, getting field observations can be difficult and expensive, and it's almost impossible to sample the entire landscape. So, you know, at this point we have these hypotheses about where we think drought refugia or hydrologic refugia might occur on the landscape. How do we go about testing those hypotheses? Well, remote sensing offers some powerful tools in this. In the case of the Landsat archive, we have data that goes back decades, every 16 days at 30-meter resolution. So that allows us to look back at past droughts, and it also allows us to look more generally at variability in climate and hydrologic conditions through time and see if we can find vegetation signatures in the remote sensing data that can help make some inferences about hydrology. And if we can find areas on the landscape that seem to be more resilient than their surroundings in terms of how they respond to droughts or interannual variability in water availability, then those are candidates for these kinds of refugia. Okay, so now I've given you a brief background. I'm going to jump into some preliminary results from the first of two studies in southern Oregon. This first one is asking whether springs, groundwater-fed springs, could be refugia in a changing climate. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborator in this, Hank Johnson, also with USGS at the Oregon Water Science Center. So in arid and semi-arid landscapes, springs can be important sources of surface water and soil moisture for wildlife and vegetation. And springs have been mentioned as climate change refugia. In fact, both of those review papers that I showed you at the beginning, both of those specifically mention springs as possible refugia. But it may be somewhat complicated because we know that springs, even in close geographic proximity to each other, can have very different hydrologic responses to climate drivers. And springs that are dependent on recent precipitation and snowmelt for their recharge might actually be pretty vulnerable to drought intensification. And in fact, some springs might run dry altogether, and that could sort of be an example of that transient refugium idea after a certain threshold is surpassed. So in general, we would expect that springs that are discharging older, deeper groundwater might be more resilient to climate change in the form of drought intensification, and those would probably have the greatest likelihood of serving as hydrologic refugia. The problem is we don't have a lot of hydrologic data for many of these springs. For example, this study area is the Steens Mountain Wilderness in southeastern Oregon, managed by the Bureau of Land Management, BLM. And there are hundreds of springs mapped in the National Hydrography data set in this area. But for the most part, they are just points on a map. Most of them have few, if any, hydrologic records. So as a result, we generally don't know the mean annual flow of most of these springs, much less do we know how that flow is changing over time in response to droughts or climate change. But if we zoom in on individual clusters of springs and we look at high-resolution satellite imagery, we often see these characteristic green areas surrounding and down gradient of springs. So that led us to ask the question of whether we could use remote sensing of the vegetation to make some inferences about hydrology and start asking some of these questions about resilience. So we used Landsat data from 1985 to 2011 to do two things. First, to delineate these green areas surrounding springs called surface moisture zones, or SMZs. And then second, to follow them through time and look at how they respond to climate drivers. So July Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI, is a spectral index from remote sensing. You can basically think of it as vegetation greenness. And so we developed 7 indicators of resilience and followed based on this time series analysis. And then we synthesized all those into an overall resilience indicator and tried to situate groups of springs along a gradient from most to least resilient within this study area. So the first 2 indicators were just the mean and the standard deviation of NDVI through time. So the most resilient SMZs, these green areas around springs in blue, generally had higher NDVI that was more stable through time compared to the least resilient groups of springs. We also wanted to look at the difference in greenness between the SMZs, these green areas around springs, and the surrounding landscape. So, for example, on the left you see a case of a resilient SMZ where the greenness in that area was quite a lot higher than the greenness of the surrounding landscape. On the right, you see a less resilient cluster of springs where the NDVI is still higher, so it's still greener. That area is still greener than the surroundings, but that difference is less, and it's less stable through time. So in this area, topographic controls on precipitation and snowpack are really important. So we did some simple linear regressions of July NDVI and the 90-day antecedent precipitation. So that would be the April to June, sort of that early growing season precipitation. And then we also did simple linear regressions of July NDVI with the previous winter's snowpack. So here, for example, on the left, you can see a case where that July greenness was relatively decoupled from the 90-day antecedent precipitation, whereas on the right, you can see there's a stronger, tighter association between that greenness and antecedent precipitation. So that can also give us some information about possible resilience to droughts. And then finally, we just took a 5-year period as an example of interannual climatic drying in the early growing season using a year that was exceptionally wet, 1998, in terms of that 90-day antecedent precipitation, followed by 4 years that were drier than average, and just looked at how those groups of springs responded over that time. And so the most resilient SMZs declined somewhat, but that response was much less intense than for the least resilient SMZs that saw a greater decline during that time of interannual drying of those early growing season conditions. So putting all these 7 resilience indicators together, we saw that they were all highly intercorrelated, so we used principal components analysis to derive an overall resilience score, and then looked at how that related to certain characteristics of the landscape. So, for example, the resilience scores were positively associated with the mean elevation and mean slope. So in this study area, we're seeing that the groups of springs higher up on the mountain and more steeply sloping topographic positions were showing greater resilience. The resilience scores were not correlated with the number of springs in each cluster, which might sound surprising, but remember, we still don't know the hydrology or the flow of any given spring. So it's not always going to be the case that more springs necessarily equals more surface water on the landscape. And the resilience scores were also not associated with the size of the SMZs. So that means that green areas on the landscape that were larger were not necessarily more resilient through time. So then at this point, what does this analysis tell us, and what are we still trying to work through? What questions do we have? Well, the big advantage of using remote sensing for these kinds of springs is that we can look at relatively large numbers of springs in areas that are more challenging to do it in the field. But of course, we have to integrate and calibrate this remote sensing with field observations. At this point, we have some preliminary assessments of how springs have responded to climate drivers in the past that may give us some information about how they might behave in the future. But we really need to integrate that and like I say, calibrate it from field observations. So the USGS Oregon Water Science Center is hoping to embark on a multi-year effort looking at the hydrogeology of springs in southeastern Oregon through field observations. The Nature Conservancy in Oregon has done a lot of work on groundwater-dependent ecosystems, including a lot of field observations of flow in more forested springs. So those are the kinds of observations that really need to be integrated with this remote sensing approach if we're going to get a handle on, predicting the possible hydrologic and subsequently ecologic resilience of springs to climate change, and possibly be able to identify possible refugia. And just to say that there's some management applications of these questions because a lot of springs have been altered, for example, diverted to provide water to livestock. And there's some interest in restoring springs so they can serve more of their ecological function. But of course, there's limited conservation dollars for doing that. So to the degree that we can provide information that's useful to natural resource managers, that may help them in some of their prioritizing some of their efforts of restoration and long-term monitoring. Okay, so now we are going to switch gears and we're going to look at a very different ecosystem, but also one in which water availability is critically important. So I'll present some preliminary results looking at refugia from drought and mountain pine beetle in a whitebark and lodgepole pine ecosystem. So in forests across western North America, drought and insect outbreaks are primary disturbance processes linking climate change to tree mortality. And we can use some of our knowledge about the physiological effects of drought and insect outbreaks and combine that with our understanding of the landscape controls on microenvironmental conditions to try to generate some hypotheses about where we might find refugia from these kinds of disturbance. So the main objective of this study was to evaluate some of those hypotheses, first by identifying refugia using remote sensing approaches, and then by modeling the landscape controls on the locations of refugia. So I'll start by giving you an overview of the methods, and then I'll walk through some of those hypotheses and the evidence that was related to each one. So the study area is the Gerhardt Mountain Wilderness in the Fremont National Forest in southern Oregon. It's about 120 kilometers east of the Cascades in a dry conifer forest transition zone between the wetter Cascades to the west and the semi-arid sage steppe of the Great Basin to the east. So in the low elevation valleys of this study area, it's mostly fir and ponderosa pine and some lodgepole pine. And then at around 2,100 meters, there's a ecotone to more homogeneous lodgepole stands, and then above about 2,200 meters, there's whitebark pine and mixed whitebark lodgepole stands. So the disturbance history of the study area includes a couple droughts, one a single-year drought in 2001, and then a multi-year drought from 2007 to 2010. So 2 years were selected for identification of refugia based on an integrated assessment of the disturbance history in the study area, and that was 2001 and 2009. So mountain pine beetle is endemic in this area, but there were no major outbreaks of mountain pine beetle from around 1980 to 2005. And then starting around 2006, we see the beginning of this really severe and widespread mountain pine beetle outbreak that affected over 80% of the study area at its peak around 2007 and 2008. This photo was taken in 2012, so it gives you an idea of the extent of the mortality in the area. So the study area, I think, is well suited for identifying refugia from drought and insect outbreaks, in part because, we have a couple of different droughts to look at that differ in their magnitudes and their disturbance interactions. And this study area hasn't had any recent fire, and because it's a designated wilderness area, it's also protected from other disturbances like land use change or logging that might otherwise make it more challenging to isolate and identify the effects of drought and insect outbreaks. So these are plots of normalized difference moisture index from Landsat in August of each year from 1985 to 2011. So NDMI has been shown to be a good indicator of canopy water content and forest responses to disturbance. And you can see that from around 1985 to about 2000, which are the shaded boxes in each plot, the NDMI was fairly stable for each of the forest types. And then in 2001, which is that first dashed line, there's a slight decrease in NDMI in each of the forest types. That was that first single-year drought that had no insect outbreak. And then for the most part, NDMI rebounded after that. But then around 2007 or so, you start to see these dramatic declines in NDMI, especially in the Lodgepole and Whitebark stands. So that was the onset of that multi-year drought that coincided with the mountain pine beetle outbreak. And based on what we know about how mountain pine beetle outbreaks occur and progress, it seems likely that the drought played at least some role in triggering that outbreak. So they're not necessarily independent of each other. Just from the Landsat data, we really can't know, say in 2009, which is that second dashed line, which of those effects are from the drought and which are from the insect outbreak. Because within any given Landsat 30-meter pixel, those effects are integrated. But I would argue that drought and insect outbreaks in forests across western North America form a sort of a disturbance regime or a disturbance syndrome acting often together, so that from a land management perspective, it might be useful to look for refugia from their combined effects, which is what the Landsat data allows us to do. So the first step in identifying refugia was to calculate a drought year anomaly. So for each of those years, 2001 and 2009, that was done just with a simple difference from reference NDMI, which is just the median value for each cell, for each Landsat pixel from 1985 to 2000, which was that period of relative stability that I showed you. And then in the bottom two boxes, you can see that the anomaly values in 2009 were a lot more severe than the ones in 2001. And here are those anomalies broken out by forest type. And we can see that in 2009, pretty severe anomalies, especially in the Lodgepole and the Whitebark stands, which is what we would expect during a mountain pine beetle outbreak. In 2001, we see these more moderate anomalies across the board. That was that single-year drought with no insect outbreak. And so to define and identify refugia from this, there's a number of ways that could be done. A simple approach is just to take some percentile value of the highest meaning the least negative anomaly in a given year. So here's an example in Lodgepole pine and Whitebark pine in 2009. If we say that we want to designate the top 10% of each of those forest type areas as refugia based on having the least severe anomalies in those years. Okay, so now I want to start talking about some of the hypotheses about where these refugia might be located, why they would be there, and then what we found. So boosted regression trees, which is a machine learning approach, was used to model the landscape controls on refugia locations. So I'll walk through some of these hypotheses. So the first one was elevation, and the hypothesis was that we would see more refugia at higher elevations. And that could be because there's greater precipitation, maybe less evaporative demand at higher elevations, possible to have greater snowpack that persists longer into the growing season. In this study area, using these methods, we did find support for that hypothesis in the lodgepole stands. So the vertical axis here is basically the probability at any given elevation of finding refugia. So we see more refugia in lodgepole stands at higher elevations, but in the whitebark and the lodgepole whitebark mixed stands, we see the opposite. There's more refugia at lower elevations. So that might be related to some of the topographic characteristics of some of those lower elevation sites that I'll show you in a minute. For slope, there was no a priori hypothesis about the relationship in part because previous studies of mountain pine beetle impacts have found positive relationships to slope or negative or no relationship to slope. And on the one hand, steeper slopes promote faster runoff, possibly less infiltration of rainfall and snowmelt, so possibly drier soils. But, on the other hand, steep slopes that are leeward could accumulate deeper snowpack. If they're topographically shaded, north-facing slopes, they might have snowpack that persists later into the growing season. So using these methods in this study area, we found more refugia on steeper slopes for each of the forest types. And related to that, we found more refugia on topographically shaded slopes. So topographic heat load index integrates slope, aspect, and latitude to give this overall metric of solar insolation or topographic shading. And the hypothesis was to see more refugia on shaded slopes, which we did see in each of the forest types. Shaded slopes, again, possibly less evaporative demand, possibly greater snowpack that persists longer into the growing season. We know from previous studies that there's greater soil water retention on those shaded north-facing slopes. So we did find support for that hypothesis. Topographic position index basically gives an indicator of how convex or concave a landscape position is. So the high values of TPI are those convex locations like ridge tops, and then the negative TPI values are those concave locations like valleys. So the hypothesis is to see more refugia in the low TPI areas like valleys, possibly because of cold air pools. So cold air pools are these temperature inversions that can happen in mountainous terrain. They can help promote dew formation and retain some humidity, possibly helping to ameliorate some of those effects from drought. So in the whitebark stands, we do see more refugia in those convergent valleys. And, that might help explain why we saw more refugia at lower elevations in whitebark, maybe down in those valleys. Whereas with lodgepole, we're seeing more refugia along these convex ridgetop kind of locations. So that's looking like these topographically shaded high elevation ridge lines in lodgepole. So we could also imagine that soil characteristics could play some role in where refugia might be located. So the hypothesis with soil bulk density was to see more refugia in less dense soil. That could be because less dense soil promotes greater root elongation and proliferation. And we did in Lodgepole see more refugia in less dense soil, not as much in the whitebark stands. And then the last one I'll show you here is that, forest stand characteristics also might play a role in where refugia could be located. So, for example, we had the hypothesis of more refugia in thinner forest stands for a couple reasons. Just from a drought perspective, thinner forest stands could have reduced competition in the form of transpiration for those limited soil water resources. And then from the perspective of mountain pine beetle vulnerability, there's been some evidence that thinner stands are less vulnerable. For example, because greater wind penetration can help disperse some of the pheromones that mountain pine beetle use to coordinate their attacks. So here we did see, especially in Lodgepole, more refugia at these lower stand densities. So those are some of the modeled relationships. I thought it could be helpful to get even a little more grounded on the landscape and maybe look at some examples of the kinds of landforms that might be associated with refugia. So I'll show you just 3 examples. These are these green boxes, and we'll start at the north, and then we'll work our way south. So this is an example of a location that was identified by the remote sensing as being a refugium. It's a steep north-facing slope. This is also a steep north-facing slope. It's at the head of a cirque, which is a glacial valley. And the aerial image here is the NAPE from 2016. So this is a late June aerial image. So you can see there's still some residual snow, even at that time of the year, uphill of where that refugium was identified. So I think it's interesting to consider whether some of these snow melt timing dynamics might have some role to play in hydrologic refugia and where they might be located. And then this last example is one of those convergent environments. So the blue line is a stream segment from the National Hydrography data set. And the refugium that was identified in the remote sensing is just adjacent to that riparian area, downslope in this from a steep northeast facing slope. So, again, as with the study on springs that I showed you earlier, we really are going to have to integrate field observations during droughts, during disturbance events, with the remote sensing if we're going to get a solid handle on, where refugia are located and the kinds of landscape and ecological processes that support refugia. But, okay, so now I want to zoom way, way out. So from a particular landform in a particular study area, now let's just zoom out to the entire Pacific Northwest, including Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, to ask whether we could identify refugia at that scale. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators in this, Josh Lawler and Julia Mahalik at the University of Washington and Solomon Dabrowski at the University of Montana. So trying to identify drought refugia at a regional scale is a big proposition, in part just because, this region is so diverse. You've got everything from temperate rainforests on the Olympic Peninsula to near deserts in the Great Basin. Here again, we do have remote sensing. So this data that you see is anomaly in enhanced vegetation index from MODIS satellite imagery at about 1 kilometer resolution in the summer of 2015, which was a drought year in some parts of the region. And the areas that have missing data are where we've masked it out because the landscape It doesn't represent natural vegetation either because it's developed or agricultural, or else because there's been recent disturbance in the form of fire or logging, that kind of thing. So even at a regional scale, we do have hypotheses for the kinds of landscape features that might support drought refugia. So that could be things like shallow groundwater, prevalence of springs, valley bottoms that might support those cold air pools I mentioned, topographic wetness, wetlands and riparian areas, some of those north-facing shaded slopes. So doing it at this scale, there's a number of challenges. One of them is just that the landscape is such a mosaic, a patchwork of natural vegetation and human-altered landscapes and land uses. Another challenge is that it's very possible that the eco-hydrologic processes that might support drought refugia, say in a high elevation forest, could be very different than those that are operating maybe in a lower elevation sage steppe, for example. So these are some of the challenges that we're going to be wrestling through over the next few months, so stay tuned. But in the rest of the time I have, I want to get at this so what question. I mean, why do we care about finding refugia at all? And in particular, how can we relate this kind of science to the needs and the priorities of natural resource managers? So for this, I want to highlight the work of Aaron Ramirez with NCEAS. He is the coordinator of the Refugia Research Coalition, the RRC, in the Pacific Northwest that is supported by the Northwest Climate Science Center. His email address is on the screen. So if you would like more information or to get involved in that effort, please contact him. I will do my best to represent the work of this group that I'm honored to be a part of, but he's the coordinator, so he can probably get you connected and answer questions if I'm not able to. So the Refugia Research Coalition in the Northwest is a group of about half scientists and half natural resource managers. So one of the first things that we did upon forming as a group was to do an informal survey of natural resource managers and ask a number of questions. One of them was just in what ways could research on refugia help address your priorities as a natural resource manager? And so I'll just read you a few quotes that we got. One manager said, if there are habitat components and associated species that will be maintained because of climate resiliency, then these would become management priorities. Another said that refugia science would help us prioritize where best to invest our limited conservation and restoration funding. And another said the ability to identify areas that are likely to serve as refugia would be useful in prioritizing potential property acquisitions. So this common thread in talking to natural resource managers is that the science around these various kinds of refugia could be useful in helping them prioritize because they have a lot of decisions they have to make on the landscape, and there's a lot of needs, and they have limited resources for doing all of that. Now, I don't think anybody would claim that identifying refugia is the only or even the primary consideration in making conservation and management decisions. But it's one tool in a larger toolbox of climate adaptation. So everything that the Refugia Research Coalition in the Northwest has been doing is situated within this climate change refugia conservation cycle. So these ideas and this figure are from Morelli et al. 2016, one of those papers that I showed you at the beginning. And it shows that just identifying where refugia are, that's just one step in this larger process that is iterative and cyclical and involves close collaboration between scientists and managers. And so some of the early work of the RRC has been some of those initial phases, like defining the planning purpose and objectives, assessing climate impacts and vulnerabilities, and looking at those conservation goals and objectives. So this is the overall approach, and it starts with the management priorities and clarifying the decision-making context. So the idea is that, natural resource managers have to make a lot of decisions in their work. And some of those decisions may be well informed by the existing science. So in those cases, synthesizing the science that exists can help support and give information to managers to help make some of those decisions. But in other cases, there may be places where the scientific knowledge just isn't there yet, or it's still emerging, so we can identify some of those knowledge gaps and try to identify science needs for future research. And the goals and process of this group, to start with clarifying the decision-making context and identifying management priority areas. When we had our first in-person meeting as a group, we, as a group, identified 4 broad ecosystem types that were going to be priorities in the context of the Pacific Northwest. Those were late successional forest, coastal and estuary systems, sage steppe and sage-grouse habitat, and riparian and river systems. And then you can imagine how within those broad categories you could sort of drill down and identify a number of, within those, a number of management priorities. So for example, within late successional forest, you could have a number of priorities within that might include, for example, some of those high elevation 5-needle pine, like the Whitebark refugia idea that I was showing you earlier. So then the ongoing work is to synthesize the available science in these different categories and then to try to identify some science needs going forward. So the timeline of this group, we started with an in-person meeting in November of last year. We've been having remote meetings since then. We're hoping to have a webinar series soon this summer, meet again in person, and then produce a final report that has a management synthesis, a science synthesis, and a synthesis of the science needs. So again, Aaron Ramirez is the coordinator of this effort, and his email address is on the screen if you'd like to get involved or have more questions about this effort in the Pacific Northwest. And then last but not least, I want to mention that there's also this new effort in the Northeast based at the Northeast, or supported by the Northeast Climate Science Center, coordinated by Toni Lynn Morelli, and her email address is on the screen. So the Northeast Refugia Research Coalition has kicked off their group, and they're starting to identify their priorities in terms of species and ecosystems. And those can include Canada lynx, salamanders in vernal pools, moose, Bicknell's thrush, coastal systems, sugar maple. So this is just to say that there are these different regional groups that are working to take some of the existing science around these various different kinds of refugia and really integrate that directly with the needs and the priorities of natural resource managers. So with that, I am done, and I can take any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you, Jennifer. Oops, hold on. I think I have one right here real quick from Robin O'Malley. She says, I really appreciate the explicit inclusion of synthesized available science as a precursor activity. While most research includes recognition of the work that has been done before, it often does not include an explicit set. Oh, just a nice note. Thank you, Robin. Tony, I see you have a question. Are you on the phone with us?
Great, thanks. Fantastic presentation, Jen. This was really fun stuff. It's super impressive to see all the work you're doing. My question, or most excitement in the moment, is like thinking about your mountain pine beetle work. So you've got this fantastic view of kind of biological response to refugia and then environmental layers that indicate where you might find refugia in other places, as well as where you kind of use them to explain the biological trends you're seeing. And within what you said, you mentioned thinning. So I feel like all of that together is this fantastic opportunity to look at other landscapes, or even within that national forest, I think it was, in other places, to say, okay, well, we can expect that these places will be most resistant to drought and pine beetle, and on top of that, you could do thinning treatments within those to make them even more resistant, because that thinning piece could kind of fall within actions in response to kind of the next step after you identify refugia. So it's just super cool, and I think there's so much opportunity to do some experimental climate adaptation work based on your results here. So thanks for sharing it with us.
Oh, great, thank you. You know, there's a number of things in what you just said. You know, I think it's interesting. There seems to be maybe a progression of ideas. You know, some of the thinking around refugia sort of started in terms of climate modeling and, you know, looking at temperature from a very sort of physical process perspective that, of course, is going to be really important. And then I think people started saying, well, okay, but what about the biology? What about the interspecies interactions? And what about disturbance? What about all these other things that we sort of know play a role in how ecosystems actually respond to environmental change? And so now it's exciting to start thinking about, okay, well, what would it look like, refugia, from all these different kinds of things, and to try to make it as much as we can sort of as holistic as possible, so that we're not just looking at things like temperature, hydrology, but we're starting to bring in, you know, all of the sort of ecological processes, which makes it a lot more complex, but hopefully over time, as a scientific community, we can refine it to where it becomes more realistic or more representative of what's going on. That's my hope anyway.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Thanks, Jen.
Absolutely. Now we have another question from Bill Kuhn. It looked like the response of whitebark pine was bimodal with high probability for refugia at both high and low stand densities. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that it's interesting because some of those, you know, to explain, you know, that was done. This was using presence of refugia as a binary response, and then using boosted regression trees to model these different landscape characteristics. And so it's interesting. I did see in a number of these that sort of these bimodal responses, and I have that same question of, is that for real? That's part of why I really hope that you know, future work can kind of synthesize some of the field work, because I would like to know, is that reflecting a real you know, sort of process on the landscape? Is that true? Or, you know, from just the remote sensing, is it possible that there's, you know, some artifact of how the Landsat was processed? So I don't at this point want to go too far out there in saying that is a true phenomenon. I think it's hard for me to read, but I think you asked, how did you measure or estimate stand density? So that's not my data. This is coming from the Forest Service Forest Health Technology Enterprise Team, some of their modeled basal area estimates by species. So I don't know if that answers the question. You know, some of these results, you know, that's kind of why I wanted to show, okay, here's the hypothesis, and in some cases, it seemed like, yeah, it's supporting what I thought, and then in other cases, either no, or there's like these bimodal responses, and then the next question is like, okay, is that real? Can we get some field observations to sort of confirm or revise some of these approaches? So I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Okay, thanks. And Dan, really quick to ask, could you put the Morelli and other references you referred to earlier back about
yes.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that is like the very first, so I'm going to have to click. I'm going to try to go back really quick all the way back to the beginning because these two papers are excellent, and they have a lot of authors on them that have been thinking and publishing about refugia way longer than I have. So if you want more information about this stuff, you can't do better than to start by reading these two papers, in my opinion.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Suzanne Baker has a question. Have you looked at cone seed transport based on mechanisms of cone movement and seed release and recruitment?
That is an excellent question. The answer is no. So, my work so far has just been purely using the remote sensing side of things, just using the spectral indices that we can get from remote sensing. But then, in talking with land managers that are more familiar with these systems, of course, that's going to be, for a refugium to really function in an ecological framework, then these things about, transport, dispersal, and then you get to the question of, okay, well, what size, what's like an area threshold for a refugium to be viable, and what's the sort of connectivity that you need in terms of seed transport. So I think that you raised sort of the next level of questions that I would have. First, I would want to, from what I've done so far, I would want to say, okay, we have these remote sensing results. The first thing I would like to see is some field, ground truthing to see if they really are where I think they are, where, the remote sensing says, and whether it's the same kind of processes that support them. And then if we develop, really high confidence that, yeah, these really are what we think they are in terms of refugia, then the question you just asked is absolutely the next step. Is like, okay, then what do we know about, sort of viability and, from an ecological perspective, the size, the connectivity, and obviously these interspecies interactions that are critically important in these habitats. So, I think given that the ideas of refugia started, like I was saying, from these really sort of temperature, physical-based, it's exciting to see now that we're getting to start to ask some of those types of questions. So I think that's kind of the next frontier.
Okay. It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in through the chat box, so I would just like to thank you, Jennifer, for your presentation, and once again thank the USGS and NCCWSCs that we work with to put on these presentations.